Bill Hewitt is going to present a program here called Through the Looking Glass, the Reflection of Military History at Gettysburg. Bill is a retired lieutenant colonel and from the U.S. Army. He served 31 years in the Army, including 6 years in intelligence and 25 years in armor and cavalry. He taught for 4 years at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff's College for Army Tactics, where he rewrote the primary tactics course for the college, supervised and reviewed all secondary tactics instruction, and conducted tactics seminars with senior Army officers. He has served as a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park for 8 years and is the author of 13 articles for journals and military publications, 2 tactical manuals, and his most recent book, The Campaign of Gettysburg Command Decisions, published in 2012, for which he just won the Batchelder Coddington Literary Award for History. Please welcome Mr. Bill Hewitt.
Can you hear me now? That's good. Okay. I wanted to thank the superintendent for the privilege of talking to everyone here today. Before I run on about what I'm going to talk about, though, if you've been here a few days, you know, you saw something that literally I'm still shaking about, and that is the celebration of the 150th. The park has never looked better. And it's to a lot of assistance from volunteers and the foundation and the park staff, and it's like I said, I'm still shaking. So hats off to them. There are a lot of different ways to look at the battle, at any battle, but here at Gettysburg we do spend some time looking at the battle through different prisms. Farmsteads, being a prisoner of war, medical, what happened to the civilians downtown, the prism of politics. One of the more overlooked prisms, in my opinion, are that of military history, and so that's what we're going to cover today. Here's my agenda. We're going to look very briefly at the general elements of an Army capabilities and how they evolve over time. And then we're going to scope down to something that happened in the Civil War that you may not have thought about, and more specifically, something may have happened here at Gettysburg that I'm still exploring that you may want to consider. History primarily concerns itself with what happened. One of our better licensed guides here said, if you want to know all about Gettysburg, read a book. And if you want to get confused, read 5. And so that's fairly true about Gettysburg. But that's what history focuses on primarily, is the what happened. Military history is concerned with that, but it goes beyond that a little bit to try to answer the question why and how. It's a little bit different. Military historians are not just historians in uniform, but they're in search of an answer as to why something happened, why an attack failed, why it was even planned. It is analysis, it is not just the facts. And the intent of military history, if you can see from the bottom of the slide, is to learn what was done right and what was done wrong, and try not to repeat errors. Criticisms are not personal. Sometimes, whether or not I'm listening to a historian or a person on the battlefield, they sometimes have, it seems to me, a personal attack. And so if we're going to criticize someone, let it be professional. These fellas are out here doing the best they can. I was talking today with a fellow that was, we were discussing Jeb Stuart. Now raise your hand if you think Jeb Stuart intentionally disobeyed the order. No, he was doing what he thought best at the time. Okay. Contrary to what some authors might say. We do look, as in military analysis, at the education of a man, the experience of the man, and what can he do to me. I look at myself, I look at my education and my background, and then I look at what I can do to him. Between those two are the options. Those are the parameters. You can call it the fog of war or whatever, but somewhere in that gap are the options of what's going to happen. We look at an army and the capabilities of an army with a couple of general categories: doctrine, leaders, equipment, and units. And you can see just a touch of some of the subcategories in each one of the major categories. Under doctrine, of course, would be tactics. Okay? Down at the bottom is an interesting one where I talk about soldier attributes. I have trained alongside a lot of different armies, and I have fought alongside some fewer number. And when you see an army in operation, you can see the different attributes that the soldiers have in that army. And so you have to take that into account as well. We're going to look at these Army capabilities, these factors, in a time frame, a little bit after the 1850s up until 1865. We're going to discuss those categories, give you the potential. Sometimes you don't get the potential. Sometimes you're going to get something less. But that will define the potential of what an Army can do. There will be weak links. So, for example, you can have terrific doctrine and great equipment and good units, but if your leaders are lacking, you're going to have a weak link there. And so you're going to perform less than optimally. Over time, you can see the different phases of how capabilities change. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that journey, if you will, during a certain time frame. Now, if you look at an army, gee whiz, you'd like all the categories to come together at the same time. That makes it real easy. But you can give up on that. That's never going to happen. It's just the way it is. There will be one thing, one item, one factor that will come along, and it will drag the other ones forward, sometimes reluctantly. Sometimes it won't drive the Army at all. Consider, for example, the Gatling gun was developed before the 1863, before the battle here. Would you think that maybe the Federal Army would have liked to have had a Gatling gun to defend against Pickett's charge? But they didn't. And so while you have development, sometimes that development's not realized for some time. And here's where Army capabilities sometimes pull the other ones forward, again, reluctantly. Sometimes an army is slow to change. We'll talk about that in a while. We also look at systems as we look at a battle. Here are some of the systems, not all. But we also look for pattern and pattern changes, and then the linkages between factors. Sometimes you get a synergistic effect where two things are going to come together. 1 and 1 is going to equal 3, and it needs to be capitalized. Sometimes there'll be an immediate impact. We're going to discuss that today, but it will also have a long-term impact. We'll also discuss that today as well. Now today we're going to focus on a very small, initially sliver, tiny sliver that's going to transcend all these different categories, and then we're going to look at it over time. That sliver is trench lines, trenches. Something simple, easy to understand. So we're going to look at it over time, and we're going to look at how trenches mature, almost near mature, near full maturity. And we're going to see how they combine with another factor, which will be the Miniball. And again, reluctantly, the combination of those two will have a significant impact for well over 100 years. Let's look at the Miniball very quickly. Of course, before that was the musket round ball. You could get off with a trained unit 3 rounds a minute at about 100 yards. that has some doctrinal implications. But then if you take that round ball and you put it into a rifled musket and you add rifling to it, now you're going to start increasing the range. And you're going to increase, if you put it into a cartridge, you're going to not only increase the range, but you're also going to increase the number of rounds you can shoot during a given time. So what are the implications of that? Well, the Napoleonic tactics of the time, and supported by McClellan and Jackson during the Civil War, an army would close within 100 yards of its adversary, fire a volley, lay out that smoke, and in that 15 or 20 seconds, then you would advance to within bayonet range. And that was the tactics of the day. And it was that simple. We're going to add entrenchments to the Miniball. Here's a picture of the 149th New York Monument up at Gettysburg. The fellers are fighting behind their entrenchments. This is the plaque from the monument itself. But let's look at the implications of trench lines. One is you have a smaller target for the defender. I'm not standing up. So you get this much to shoot at. And in an era where there was not a lot of marksmanship, that's a significant advantage. So it's going to add challenges to the attacker, and it adds safety to the defender. And as long as the defender is alive, the attacker is going to have problems. It's fairly simple in that regard. So now I get to open at about 300 yards, and I get 5 or 6 shots off at a defender before he can get close to me. So if I'm going to attack a man, I need more men on a narrower front, and I can have less defenders to achieve equilibrium. Am I losing anybody yet? Okay. So what do you have when you have the Miniball and trenches? It makes the bayonet obsolete, and it makes cavalry charges obsolete. Now, does this mean there were no bayonet charges after the Miniball and trench lines? Were there no cavalry charges? The bayonet is now used as a last resort, and rightfully so. No one wants to stick around with that thing coming at you. As for cavalry charges, they went up into World War II when the Polish cavalry charged German tanks. How do you think that went? Not good. So the leaders in those armies were slow to adapt. But again, the bayonet would become obsolete because of the Miniball and the trench line. Let's look a little bit about the history of entrenchments. Here you have an entrenchment down at Yorktown. It's significant that I'm going to ask you to hold this thought for about 30 minutes. It's significant that trench lines prior to the Civil War, if they were parallel, they were in the offense only. You build a trench line, you build the next trench line closer in concentric circles to move the siege guns forward to get you closer to your objective. And that's what parallel trench lines were for, single lines of trenches in the defense. Okay, so hold that thought for a while. You look at the early Civil War. Now, this is not a trench line, but more just a slit in the ground. But you look at the trench lines in the early Civil War, they're very simple. By the time Vicksburg comes, if you can see it on that slide, now you're going to start developing, if you will, cubby holes where the soldiers can live, and they will be near the trench lines. When Grant was sieging Vicksburg, he used concentric lines for the advance, and out of necessity, the Confederates will use concentric lines in the defense. But that's only because Grant was pushing forward methodically. Here is a Cold Harbor trench line. If you look off to the left of the slide, you're going to see a little cubby hole. So the trench lines are going to become a little bit more sophisticated by the late Civil War. Everybody see it? By the end of the Civil War, here's the trench lines at Spotsylvania. You will note the Confederate is in red here and the Union is in blue, but you will now start to see concentric defensive trench lines. Here are the multiple parallel trench lines in defense around Richmond. General Grant, because these pose a new challenge to him, will move south rather than attack the trenches protecting Richmond. And he will move to Petersburg, of course. So let's take a look at Petersburg. Here is one trench line in Petersburg, fairly simple. But here's another trench line at Petersburg. And again, now you start to see cubby holes where soldiers not only live but also fight from that trench. These are very sophisticated trench lines. And again, they're in the defense. And that's going to have doctrinal implications we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's a World War I trench. Anybody see any similarities between that trench and that trench? See it. So again, you see the journey of trenches. What does that mean? What does a trench line, multiple trench lines in the defense mean? If you take the bullet and put a cartridge in it and put it into a firing platform that can fire multiple rounds, whether or not it's a Gatling gun, a repeating rifle, even a machine gun, what is that going to do to a linear advance that you see now? Remember my question earlier about wouldn't it have been nice to have a Gatling gun at Pickett's charge? After the Civil War, you're going to start to see trench lines not 20 miles long, but now 50 miles long in Europe during World War II. So what does that do? In the Civil War, when line attacked line, it was one-dimensional, linear, length. That's all that was important, was the length of your line, one dimension. Napoleon talked about destroying the equilibrium of a defender. What did he mean? He means breach the line. All I have to do is breach the line, and then I have the enemy where I want him. But now let's think about that. Now you have multiple lines in the defense. How are you going to breach that? Here is a World War I multiple trench line. In the upper left-hand corner is a British trench line, and on the right side of the screen is a German trench line, very complex. And so as you have to think through that challenge, if you're going to attack that, you've not only got to think linearly, but what else do you have to think? Depth. I not only have to seize the line in front of me, now I've got to seize the line that's behind that line and the line that's further on. And so now I'm gone to the second dimension. I not only worry about length, but now I must worry about depth. And how am I going to defend it, or how am I going to use depth as an attacker? Again, there's the World War I solution. How costly was that? Again, the leaders failed to adapt. They did not understand what was going on, and the valuable life of a soldier did not matter much, apparently, during that time frame. So what's the solution to this trench line problem? I need something that can cross trench lines fairly reliably. I need something that the bullets will bounce off, right? And I need something that has mobility. What's the solution there? You got it, the tank. Do you see how these things react and how they grow on each other? How after every action, there's a further development, and it's all a journey. And if you look at that as a journey, you can see it. It's up in front of you. It's staring you right in the face. Great little weapon, the tank. I'm partial to tanks, especially the Abrams tank. So here is the journey over time that started off as a sliver in the Civil War, a single trench. and how it will develop with the advent of the machine gun and the trench line. Now we're going to go from Napoleonic linear battles to trench line battles, and then to maneuver warfare, they call it today, which most people call blitzkrieg, that the German developed during the 1940s. You're going to see leaders evolve. That'll be picture of George Patton. You could put down Guderian or Rommel. You're going to have units that are armored rather than the 5 tanks that were in World War I that started this in the American Army. Now you're going to have hundreds and thousands of tanks in units. And with the advent of the aircraft by World War II, now you've added the third dimension. Not only length, but in depth, but height. Would anyone care to mention what the fourth dimension is? We are starting to conquer it now. It is time. Time. The fourth dimension. But again, you see the journey. Now, let's scope down a little bit. We're going to look at a couple of trench lines here at Gettysburg. Most of you'll probably recall, you've seen them if you've been around the battlefield, up at Culps Hill, and some other ones. We're going to come back to number 2 in a little bit, but we want to talk about some lesser known trenches as well. First of all, you have the one up on Culps Hill. It's across the street from the Slocum Monument. Iron Brigade was in that area on the evening of the 1st and will fight from that area. After the battle, that's what that trench line looked like. Very simple. Very simple. Again, just a linear trench, augmented with logs and maybe some big boulders or something to add protection. Nothing significant. Also on Culps Hill, near the 78th and 102nd New York, that same similar trench line. And if you've been up on Culps Hill, you've seen that, I'm sure. And there it is at the time of the battle. Again, you can see the stones and the logs to increase the protection of the defenders. If you go south and east from the Pennsylvania Monument, you're going to come on a stone wall. And if you follow that line of the stone wall, because the 3rd Corps soldiers talked about entrenching after they were forced off of the peach orchard. And so if you go to the Pennsylvania Monument and move off to the south and east, it's nothing more now than a mound. I'm standing on it. You can barely see it, but it is there. And that was where the 3rd Corps reorganized for the 3rd of July. Many of you have been up to the angle, I know, many times, and it's a stone wall. But if you follow that stone wall down to the end of the stones, you're going to come to a trench line. It's a dirt trench. It goes all the way from the end of the stone wall, and it goes almost all the way to the Pennsylvania Monument. It is a straight line. Some of it is visible from across the street. General Lee might have seen it, but a lot of it is not there. Standards Brigade of Vermonters will be in that trench line, and during the cannonade, because the cannonade was so terrible, they'll ask permission and receive permission to move forward. And so when they move forward, it's only about 75 yards or so, but when they move forward, they can now devastate Kemper's brigade in the attack of Pickett's charge and force Kemper more north. And then they will be able to swing out and fire into the flank. So the trench line here will not be used, but will still have an impact on how the battle evolves. Now here's a good one. I'll bet not many people know about this. We have a park ranger here named Chris Gwynn, and several years ago Chris was an intern here and then a seasonal, and he said he'd been reading that A.P. Hill entrenched on the 4th of July. And so on a kind of a miserable day, it was rainy, and we went in search of this trench. Well, we knew where the cannon line was, And doctrinally, we know that from the cannons, 49 yards to the rear, are the caissons and limber. And so we allowed 50 yards, and then we started looking for the trenches. And I'm standing in it. It's not much, but it is the trench line that A.P. Hill's men entrenched on. And once you know the doctrine of an army, it's easier to find these things. It was exactly where it was supposed to be, and I'm again standing in it. What I'd like to do in conclusion is go back to a trench up on Culps Hill. And I want to read you a couple of accounts of soldiers up on Culps Hill. And remember our earlier discussion about multiple trenches in the defense. This is one of the brigade commanders that is attacking Culps Hill on the afternoon of the 2nd of July. My men gained ground steadily to the front under a heavy fire of musketry from the enemy, protected by entrenchments. When near the first line of entrenchments, moving with my troops, I received a flesh wound through the thigh. Many of you know that's Jones's brigade. But again, he said the first line of entrenchments. The next brigade commander would write, this would be Williams, the brigade engaged the enemy near the base of these heights, and having quickly driven his front line into the entrenchments near their crest, continued forward until it reached a line 100 yards from further enemy entrenchments, where it again engaged him for almost incessantly for 4 hours. A double line of entrenchments on Culps Hill. And now Ben Jones of the 44th Virginia would write about this same time. When the order came, we crawled over the creek and rugged rocks the best we could and charged the first line and took it. But the enemy held another ditch further up the hill, filled with men firing at our heads. We could not hold what we had already gained, hence we were driven back for a few hundred yards, from whence we would reform and charge again, with like results 3 times. Again on Culps Hill, there were double line of entrenchments. So, to my analysis, this is the first evidence of a double line of entrenchments in the defense. Now, most historians will not get that. They don't understand the significance. They don't understand the implication that this will have later on. I'm certain that the general up there, General Greene, did not converse with Lee and say to General Lee, put double line of entrenchments around Richmond. I know that. But again, we're looking at a journey. And the first time we see entrenchments, parallel lines in the defense, is at Gettysburg, over on Culps Hill. So, the military historian looks at things a little bit differently than a regular historian. Here are some of the questions that we have as we go through our analysis. I'll let you read those for a minute or two. Everybody with it? Again, the job of the military historian is to not only see what's happening in front of you, but also to correct it. If there is a weakness in your army that the enemy is exploiting, you must not let it manifest itself for very long. You have to solve the problem. And maybe, if you're good at what you do, I am not. I'm a poor student on some days and not a very good student at all on other days. But if you're good at what you do, you can predict and drive change. rather than let someone else drive it for you. They will be glad to do that. So, what are your questions on trenches at Gettysburg? Or trenches in general? You don't get away that easily.
Good afternoon, Colonel, and thank you for the talk. One of the responses that the Germans did to British trenches in World War I was reorganizing their army into smaller groups, company and platoon size outfits called Stoßtruppen, literally translated stormtroopers. And they used those to execute infiltration tactics in and around the British strong points. The Brits went more for a technical solution, developing the tanks, as you pointed out. The Germans, not so much the tanks, but they relied more on the organizational changes that you pointed out in your last slide there. Was there any significant thought given during the Civil War to organizing smaller units to overcome trench warfare where people encountered it?
You will remember, I think I had one of these on one of these slides as a title, Leaders React Slowly. You know, there's a common phrase in the Army that says, he's fighting the last war. You may have heard it. That's not good if they're talking about you. This has implications for the organizations as well. When you have lines attack like this against machine guns, the officer is no longer important. The officer gives the order, but the men have to execute it. The supervisor of the men are the sergeants. Because of this, we're going to have the elevation of the sergeant. And in our Army, one of our great strengths is our sergeants, because we're not going to do this anymore. So it does have organizational impact as well. But we were slow to react, and we won't learn that lesson until World War II. And if you look at the casualty list of World War I, it wasn't worth it. The leaders let us down a little bit.
Bill, great presentation. Is there any evidence of that first line of entrenchments still on Culps Hill?
I have looked a long time, and the entrenchments that are up there have been rebuilt, as you know, at least once, if not twice. And I've looked for that other set of entrenchments because I really wanted to have a picture of me standing in them. But we do know that they were about 60 to 80 yards from the crest of the hill. All the accounts of the second entrenchment was about 60 to 80 yards from the top of the hill. So we'll keep looking.
Yeah. Bill, where does the idea for a tank come from? Does it come from the ground? Does it come from the upper command? Does a military analyst come up with it? Where does the idea for a tank originate?
There are certain people that come along that really have a forward vision of what has to be done. And you remember, for example, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, there's any Navy guys in here, or Air Force, but I think it was General Doolittle that said that the airplane could take off from ships. And that was, he was disciplined for that, even in thinking that, because it was too much for the elephants to absorb. So as far as the tank, I think it might have been shared between the French and the British.
So given the technology that we have today, I'd be curious as to what your vision is as to what the great challenges are going to be in order to be able to sustain, let's say, a war in the future. Is it going to be communications? Because obviously, you know, in a mobile war, communications between units is going to be key.
Everybody hear that? If you ask me for a crystal ball, like I said, I'm just a student. The conquering of time has certain requirements. One is that everybody has to have an accurate picture of where they are and where the enemy is. They have to have weapons that can attack the enemy where he's at accurately. They may not be lethal. Don't have to be lethal, maybe. You have to have leaders that are not afraid. You might remember in the advance toward in the Iraq War, in the advance toward Baghdad, we were advancing and a squad of mechanics took a wrong road and got captured. Jessica Lynch was a POW until we remember that. And there were a couple fellows get killed. And they had all the retired guys on TV trying to give analysis. And their analysis was, gee whiz, we have to slow down and get our forces right. We cannot have the enemy in our rear. This is old thought. These are elephants. If you are in the enemy's rear, by definition, he is in yours. And so all you need is courage and just solve the problems when they come up. But don't overreact. This is linear warfare is done. But the elephants. What other questions do you have? Some of those elephants are nice guys. Don't get, you know.
Sir, with your background, where would you say, and I know I'm asking you to predict this, but with our current drone technology, where does that take us in the future, and who becomes important, and who comes to the top of the pyramid with our new technology?
The weakness, she asked about drone capability. The weaknesses for the drone are loiter time and weaponry. If you said to me, how would you fix it, I would not be impaired by loiter time. I would have, for example, if I was in control of Baghdad or something like that and my people kept getting killed by IEDs, I would have real-time satellite coverage, geosynchronous orbit, right? And so I'm looking. And if anybody gets within 100 yards of a road I use, I'll kill them. And then I'll send a message to the other ones. And so what I'm suggesting to you is we need to improve on the drone. It's not perfected yet. It's a good step forward, but it's not perfected yet. That's part of the conquering of time. I can conquer part of the time. I need to conquer all of it. Okay?
You had mentioned the fact that the Gatling gun had been invented by 1863. Why wasn't anybody using it?
If I'm not mistaken, it's because they didn't want to waste so many bullets. Given that 9 or 11 million are fired at Gettysburg, I think we could afford another million and saved a lot of lives. Anything else? I didn't know it was going to cause this many questions.
Unless I'm wrong, I read somewhere that Lincoln sized up the use of the Gatling gun, and he almost thought it was like a...
Can you come over here about 10 feet, so because I can't hear very well?
The fan. Lincoln sized up using Gatling guns, and he almost was going to do it, but he thought it was like a weapon of mass destruction. He thought it would be too horrendous to use that. I don't know if I read that correctly or not.
Any other questions in there?
It should be on.
Is it on? Okay. Bill, in relationship to practicality of trenches today, in, say, your modern warfare in Afghanistan, where you have the forward operating bases, and basically they're just sitting in entrenchments surrounded by bad guys that are attacking them every day. Is there a practicality to establishing bases like that with entrenchments around it, where they really have to go out and patrol in order to keep the enemy at bay?
One of the biggest enemies we have is our own State Department. If I've always, the eagle has talons, and one is the arrows, and the other is the olive branch. And if we can kind of keep them separated, we'll be better off. We offer the olive branch, but the rules of engagement have not been. I wouldn't fight under them. I wouldn't have my men fight under them. That's why I never made general. Any other questions? Folks, I wanted to also, because you've heard some authors talk today about what they are trying to sell you, and so I want to be clear about what I'm trying to sell you here for the book signing. It is not about trenches and mini-balls. I might mention them briefly in passing, but my book covers the decisions of Hooker and Meade and Lee, the handful of decisions that these fellas make, why they make them during that time frame. What are they trying to do? What goes wrong or right? You might recall we started our talk by saying, if you read one book, you're an expert on Gettysburg, and if you read 5, you're confused. I have told people, don't buy my book if you have not read at least a few books on Gettysburg, because you are not sufficiently confused yet as to what might have gone on here and why. And so the intent of my book, again, is to take the leaders, the decision makers, take their education, their background and experience, their own words. I'm often amazed at a historian that looks at a word and glances right over it. Lee writes, for example, when he's talking about the seizure of Winchester, Greencastle, and Chambersburg, he calls them demonstrations. These demonstrations have not had the proper effect yet. What's a demonstration? You are trying to get somebody's attention, and you have failed to do so. And if you don't understand the definition of what a demonstration is, your eyes will go right over that. But if you know what the definition is, you'll focus at what comes next. Because then he says, I decided to move on Harrisburg. Maybe that will get their attention. So again, my book is not about trench lines too much or mini balls. It is about analysis of their decisions, what they did and what they did not do. Sir, did you have a question? I've got 10 more minutes before this machine blows up in my face.
It seems to be that at Gettysburg, on your opinion, Lee wasn't quite himself for health reasons. Seems like he made a lot of decisions here that were different than he did in the other battles. Can you reflect on that?
There have been a lot of speculation about Lee's health. This is serious business. If you can't do it, then get out of the way. I'm going to suggest to you something else. Lee ran into something here that he had not seen before. And it is a commander that has a different stress level in the Army of the Potomac. George Meade is a very capable commander. I know if you were here last week, you may have heard other But General Meade was a very capable commander, and he had a high stress level. For 2 years, whenever the Army of the Potomac got surprised, what would it do? It would run back to the protection of Washington, right? The defenses around Washington. On the 2nd of July here at Gettysburg, under a fairly substantial flank attack, the Federal Army does not retreat. General Meade shifts 89% of his regiments on that day. Now, when you consider that you start the day out, you place your regiments where you want them. Your regiments, brigades, divisions, and corps, right? And so at the beginning of the day, General Meade said, I am satisfied with this. And by the end of the day, he will move almost 90% of them. And so there's a change here at Gettysburg that I don't think General Lee understood. He'll write 3 weeks later, still not recognizing the change. He'll write Jefferson Davis and say, I wouldn't have ordered Pickett's charge if I didn't think it was going to succeed. He doesn't understand the change in the Federal Army. You see, part of his reputation is based upon the response of what he had gotten before. And if you're up against some of the other fellas who will remain nameless, you might have gotten away with it at Gettysburg. Any other questions? I've got 3 minutes. This thing's a claymore. And I got to get off here in 3 minutes. Any other questions at all? Okay, folks, thank you very much. If you want to come talk, I'll be glad to.